Our next panel is, we've got Mike Diaz from Watercourse Engineering, and then we've got Carson Jeffers from the UC Davis Center for Watershed Sciences, and they're going to talk about habitat conditions in the Shasta River Watershed.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for attending, and thank Amy Campbell for setting this all up and inviting us up to present information to you. So my name is Mike Diaz from Watercourse Engineering. I'm presenting today with Carson Jeffers from the Watershed Sciences Center at UC Davis. We're going to be talking about, well, I'm going to split this thing. I'm going to talk about thermal diversity in the system. He's going to talk about habitat conditions, and every good picture that's on here is his. Except maybe that one. And that's not mine. So we're going to talk briefly about thermal diversity. It represents the variability in space and time of thermal conditions in the system. It varies by season, obviously. So if we go up to the big springs that people have been talking about, you would say in the summer it's a cool water source into a warm water system. In the winter, it's a warm water source into a cool water system. In the spring and fall, it's neutral. The river is the same temperature as the spring is the same temperature as the river, approximately. Habitat diversity is a very important consideration for anadromous fish and other aquatic ecosystems. I have a couple of citations up here, thermal gradients. Another example of these, and Todd Soto and Alex have done a lot of work in the main stem Klamath, where they have thermal refugia in the summer, where cold water habitats from tributary mouths create habitat. And these fish utilize the main stem during portions of the day in certain cases, and then they retreat to their thermal refugia, if you will, during the day or the hotter part of the day. So it's common in this neck of the woods. If you were in Alaska, we wouldn't have this conversation at all. So considerations for temperature management for fishes. We do a lot of work with temperature throughout the state of California and southern Oregon. One of the things we come across a lot, what is a very clear management objective? Not just more of something or less of something, but what is your objective? Characterize that thermal diversity, location, extent, persistence. If you have a refugia on the main stem and you run out of water on August 1st, that's just a death sentence for those fish because they are truly in a jail cell. Temporal variability, all the way down to the subdaily basis. The thermal refugia, for example, on the Klamath, expand in the early morning hours when temperatures are at minimum, and at 3 in the afternoon, they might be the size of one of these tables or even smaller, and all the fish are crowded into there, all the way up to weekly, annual, interannual variations. All these things are important. We have the tools today, we have the equipment, we have the know-how. Weekly average temperature, monthly average temperature, this stuff should be cast aside to really craft management solutions for fish. Habitat value, is it useful? So you have great cold water, but it's an inch deep, crystal clear, and there's a great blue heron that lives there every day. Not good fish habitat. Interannual variability, stability, understanding utilization of thermally desirable habitats in space and time. As Dave mentioned, this river is overallocated. Does not have enough water to irrigate all the irrigable lands. This is such a common practice throughout the West that we have species that use various life stages. So do you need 13-degree water 365 days a year everywhere in your system? I don't know where that really exists, actually, in a system-wide basis. So what you're looking for is where do you need it, when do you need it, what temperature? And Carson will talk about the habitat. If we craft solutions that bring us into focus on separate life stages and their requirements, we can take systems that have multiple uses that need to be balanced or limited resources and make some headway on them. Identify management options, controllable, uncontrollable. It's going to be a dry year, looks like, and no matter how much we do, we can do lots of things and it's probably still going to be dry. We can't have every year like last year that was nice and wet. And then in the end, you want to consider climate change. So the Shasta River Basin, combination of precipitation and spring flow dominated hydrology. Precipitation, as Bill Chesney said, is both winter rainfall as well as snowmelt runoff. Gives you a double hump hydrograph. We saw that. But this is imposed upon a very special system that has a very strong base flow signal due to springs. So it's a very complicated creek. It's very unique. Seasonal water use plays a role in water temperature conditions, spatially and temporally. There are diversions from the system. That depletes flow. There are return flows to the system. This water use can have an impact on temperature. Okay, just that's the way that is. Extensive spring systems, however, play a very important role in summer here as they provide a very stable flow condition in their discharge areas, and those temperatures are fairly stable as well. In this case, we're going to be talking about Big Springs. Stable spring flows buffer seasonal temperature changes. That's why Big Springs is warm in the winter, 10 degrees, 12 degrees, and cool in the summer, 10 degrees, 12 degrees Celsius. While outside temperatures in the winter, downstream temperatures or upstream temperatures might be in the low single digits, and in the summer they can be in the 20s. So we're talking the springs are coming out at 52, 55 degrees Fahrenheit, winter temperatures in the low 40s, summer temperatures in the high 70s. Oops, wrong one. So really quickly, I don't know if we've seen enough maps today. So here's the Klamath River up here. The Shasta River runs from south to north. Little Shasta comes out of the Cascades. There's Wairika Creek, Julian Creek. Here's Big Springs Creek. Parks Creek comes out of the Scott Mountains. So do the headwaters of the Shasta. But the Shasta is also supported by Bowles Creek, Bowden Creek, Carrot Creek, and Big Springs Creek adds an appreciable base flow to it. If we look at where the springs are located, they're roughly all on a contact line between the Cascades and the metasedimentaries. So we have a nice set of springs on the Little Shasta, the Big Springs complex proper, and then a whole host of little springs here, and then these spring creeks here that are higher up on the mountain but do provide basic base flows for the Shasta River. We're going to look at this little section here really quick, and just to give you an idea, if you take the flow discharge from Big Springs, it's about equivalent to every other dot on here. So it's a big spring. It's amazing how they name those things that way. So really quickly, this is kind of a basic summer picture of the system where you have cold waters emanating from Big Springs and Big Springs Creek. So this is cooler and this is warmer. It comes down, hits the Shasta, and does create a thermal benefit in the main stem proper for some distance downstream. That moves. That moves based on water usage in Big Springs Creek and meteorological conditions and water use upstream of Big Springs Creek in the Shasta. If you have a lot of warm water coming down, this is going to be diluted and the little blue line will move up. If this diminishes and there's not a lot of water use here and it's a little cooler, it will move down. If it's a wetter year, it will extend farther. If it's a dry year, it will move upstream. So your habitat is variable in there. But what's really interesting about Big Springs is we don't call this a thermal refugia in the classic sense. These other springs are thermal refugia. You stay, you check in, and you don't check out until fall. Long-term lease, okay? And it's a small area. This provides a linkage of habitats where fish can move great distances, a mile and a half, 2 miles, anytime they want. They may not, but the choice is theirs, while other refugia, they have no choice because the surrounding waters are at temperatures that are not conducive to those fish. So we have kind of a multi-egged basket here. You have Parks Creek that has some thermal conditions that are very beneficial to coho. For the summer life stage, I'm being very specific about that. We're not talking about spawning or migration right now, just summer over-summering habitat. We have places on the main stem Shasta below Durnell that are also cold springs where we know there are coho at. Those are all what we would term classic thermal refugia. We have Big Springs. The creek itself is a couple of miles of habitat. We have that extension downstream into the Shasta. And building on what Dave said, our main goal here is to extend that cold water habitat farther and farther and farther with improved water management, with improved riparian vegetation, with improved channel conditions, so that you stretch that cold water out as far as you can. Because no matter what you do in this basin, if you take the cold water away, you can't make it again. You can plant trees all the way to the mouth, and you're not going to have 13-degree water at the mouth in August. It's just not going to happen. It's too adverse a heating environment. So you want to extend this and protect this as best you can, and then work on these other refugia as well. That has been our basic model of recent times, not saying that it won't change and our learning will evolve, but that's what we've been up to. So in summary, you want to assess cold water over summering habitats to include both local or classic thermal refugia, as well as reach-scale cool water habitats that allow more flexibility for fish to move if conditions change. Groundwater-driven base flows buffer seasonal temperatures as well as climate change, because we have that big mountain up there. I didn't talk much about climate change, but it's a very important element that it seems like this system is far more robust to that than many others. Vegetation shading, flow management are options to protect and enhance cold water after Dave's talk. And protection of that groundwater element is really critical. If you lose it, you cannot get it back because we can't make that cold water. It's groundwater, it's been in the ground a long time, it's come into equilibrium with the temperature of the earth pretty much. And if you were to diminish those cold water supplies, you would not have a replacement in this case. I don't think I have anything else here, no. So that's my talk for now, and we can take questions after Carson talks? Okay, thank you.
I feel like I've just been to class on how to use a microphone and a pointer. So I'll see if I can do both of these things at once. All right, so Mike talked about the water temperature component of habitat, which is really the kind of physical condition that's happening in there. And I'm going to talk about more of the structural component and some of the food resources that makes habitat in the Shasta River. And so when talking about what is a habitat, you have your environmental conditions, like your temperature, your dissolved oxygen, kind of basically your water quality that's there within the physical habitat. You have your food, which is really an important part of your habitat. If you don't have food, but you have a great home, things aren't going to turn out well. And then we have the physical structure of the habitat. It can be depth, velocity, it's your protection from predators, and it's also a place for you to more or less, for a fish to take a break. If you have to stay out in the current the whole time, things aren't going to be good. You're just going to be burning through your energy, and so that's all of these things are necessary for having a functional habitat in the Shasta River. First thing that we got to talk about, though, this is not Shasta River habitat. The Shasta River is something a lot different than what we think of when we think of a traditional coho habitat. Traditional coho habitat is large wood debris, you have scour pools, you generally have cool summers, it's a coastal system. And all of those things that I just talked about as far as what makes a habitat, you can see in a river like this. This is Lagunitas Creek in Marin. You have your pools created by your large wood debris right here, and that's really your shelter, and it's also your depth and your velocity refuge. You have if you look here, there's moss on things. Moss only grows in relatively cool places. You don't see moss in the desert as a general rule. So this place is generally cool. And then you can kind of see these riffles here. These are full of bugs. That's where you get your food resources from. And so this is generally what we think of when we think of a coho habitat. The Shasta River is not traditional coho habitat. We have, like Mike said, it's fed by springs, and those springs are really rich in geologically derived nutrients. And this is something that is really important for the overall food web and what makes this such a productive coho habitat. The main reason is that those geologically derived nutrients are fueling this food web from your basic carbon sources. And these are the primary producers in here. Primary producers not only provide your carbon for your food web, but they also provide the structural habitat. They're your velocity refuge, they're your refuge from predators, and what you can see here is this is a school of coho, and they're able to sit behind the aquatic macrophytes that are a velocity refuge in there, and then they're able to dart out and feed as they wish. And it also functions as a cover, overhead cover, since they do extend out of the water in most situations, that they are able to, provide reasonable habitat for juvenile coho. Probably the most interesting thing about the Shasta, though, is how you take those geologically derived nutrients, move it through the primary producers, and ultimately create this secondary production that is pretty much unparalleled, I would say, in aquatic ecosystems. I don't know if anybody can see this really well. This is what the substrate looks like in the Shasta River. Those are scuds. It kind of looks gross, I'll be honest with you. If you're swimming around in the Shasta River, sometimes it is kind of gross. Our invertebrate samples that we've been getting there, we find on the order of 100,000 individuals per meter squared of substrate. And what makes it so interesting is that we go back to that structural habitat, is that when we think of the Shasta River, the habitat is in 3 dimensions. Normally we think of a river and habitat, we think of 2 dimensions. So you sample just the substrate on the bottom because there isn't that 3rd dimension that creates an additional surface area for the invertebrates to grow. And so with that additional surface area, you have more periphyton, you have the seasonal senescence of the aquatic macrophytes, so you have a large breakdown, the seasonal breakdown of your carbon source, and that carbon is ultimately taken up by the invertebrates that create the food source in the Shasta River. And so a combination of these things ends up in a situation like what you see here. You can see the food swimming by, you have a diverse habitat hydraulically. You can see the fish in the back are barely swimming, but you have the fish in the main current that are feeding. And so you have this diversity of habitats with abundant food sources. As Bill had talked about earlier, is we have smolts that emigrate at 0+ in March. The only way you can get large enough to emigrate at 0+ is by having all of these conditions together. And that you have warm winter temperatures, relatively speaking, so you emerge earlier, you grow faster, you have more food resources, and you have this diverse habitat where you're able, all of those things are necessary to grow fast enough to be bigger, faster, and stronger than everybody else out there. And so these are the conditions that create that. And the growth rates are pretty amazing also. Chris Adams has done a lot of work showing how quickly these fish grow. And it's, looking around through the literature, there's very few places in the wild where fish can grow this fast. The only place that's really comparable is a hatchery, where they're fed to satiation and essentially ideal growing conditions. And in some kind of scary ways, the Shasta River functions as a hatchery where you have these great growing conditions and you're able to have fish growing. We have Chinook that mature in their first year, steelhead grow at pretty amazing rates. When you stick your head in the water here, it doesn't look like you're seeing fish that have just emerged during their first year. And so I think it's just important when you think about the Shasta River is that it's not a regular Coho stream. It's not riffle pool sequences. When we first got here, we tried to type it as a regular Coho stream. I'm like, oh great, it's a 35-mile run glide. That was easy. And that's not how it works here. It's really different when you have to think about it. And once you go out and see it, you notice that right away. And I think that's the most important thing, particularly for the people who have not seen this that are part of this group, that when you think of the Shasta River, it's you have to kind of tweak your concept of what a Coho River is when you're looking at managing this in the long run. And I think that's about it.
Okay, we'll have time for some questions. I'm going to ask Mike and Carson to take a seat at the panel table there, because then we have mics for both of you, and then that gives me an extra mic to move around. So I don't think I asked you to applaud. This would be a good time. Okay, Rick, I see the first question for you.
Yeah, Rick Costalis with Rick Costalis with Siskiyou County. Mike, you were talking about flow and the importance of springs in that flow. There's a lot of emphasis on flow in the Shasta River. We're looking at the 2 different unimpaired flow models that Jim showed, and I guess one of them was yours. To what degree do we really need to understand this system to start increasing flow when we add more warm water and may tend to overpower the cooling effect of those the springs in the system? I mean, the springs being critical. Could you talk about that issue, about that, what sort of balance is required when we're looking at flows relative to those springs?
Yes, and it goes back to the, what, where, when. What's your objective? What are you trying to do? The Bennett work for the unimpaired flows, I don't know who actually, if Jim or Bill presented that. Those are flows at the mouth. Okay, so those are based on the bottom of the system. And if you were to put a gauge, for example, on Big Springs Creek, it would not show that large a depletion because there's not that much diversion from that particular system. So you really want to ask yourself, do I want to spend, all of my budget and resources trying to attain something far from my point of interest or at my point of interest. So those are not decisions for me to make or even suggest to you, really, but where are you trying to get your cold water habitats for summer? That's a question I would ask. And then seek the flow modifications to, maximize that benefit. Where is that maybe a little lower priority or a much lower priority? You've got to break your basin apart a little bit and figure out what you want to do, where and when, and for what purpose. Trying to do everything everywhere is just such a common. I mean, we work all over the state, and everywhere everybody wants everything always at every location, and that's really a tough place to start when you're trying to balance resources. So that's kind of, I mean, maybe answer your question exactly. You're right. If you just keep adding warm water, as I mentioned, if you put a lot of water down the system from the upper Shasta and it washes by Big Springs Creek and it's really warm, you're going to diminish that benefit that Big Springs Creek has in the Shasta below the confluence. Those are questions you guys have to work through and balance out as everybody works together to resolve this problem and find the best path forward. That help?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Jim.
Hi, Jim from NOAA Fisheries. Carson, have you, have you evaluated productivity in other reaches besides Big Springs? I'm interested in information on food for salmonids and other reaches.
Yeah, we've actually done the invertebrate work all throughout the Shasta River, from Big Springs Creek down to the mouth. For the most part, there's almost unlimited food resources for the bug. We still see down at the mouth somewhere in the neighborhood of about 20,000 individuals per meter, which is still pretty impressive. I mean, compared to lots of other reaches, and you see that macrophyte growth throughout the river. And so you have to think about it, that it is that three-dimensional substrate that it's kind of cheating when you say per meter squared, because it's not really per meter squared, it's through aerial coverage. But we have seen that productivity extended all the way throughout the watershed.
Can I add a point?
Yes, go ahead.
Jim, UC Davis has also, I think through a reclamation grant, looked at water quality down the river. And one of the elements that's interesting is the plants remarkably scrape out almost all of the nitrogen by the time you get to, say, maybe A12. And so you have persistent growth at a primary production stage to support secondary production and tertiary production. But once you, all year, but once you fall below A12 in the summer, sometimes there's more variability down there. Just something to think about.
We have a question on the other side of the room.
Mike, Kevin Malone. I thought I heard they're doing both flood irrigation and pumping in the Shasta. And if that's true, is there a better, which would they prefer to do for water quality, groundwater recharge, et cetera? Is flood irrigation the way to go, or is it pumping?
I don't quite understand. Do you mean for water supply for their fields, or?
Well, I'm looking at for spring. I heard a previous presentation say that maybe Big Springs used to be 125 CFS, and now it's 85 CFS. And I heard that people are flood irrigating, and there's an issue coming back. So maybe the question is, if you got rid of flood irrigation, would that mean a decrease in Big Springs outflow over time? Or so should people be emphasizing groundwater pumping in the Shasta or flood irrigation in the Shasta?
I think that up gradient of Big Springs, so we're thinking the recharge area, the pinnacle of that is Mount Shasta. And then if you draw a line to Big Springs, there is some irrigated agriculture up there, but I think most of the flood irrigation is in downstream reaches. There's a little bit upstream, but from a recharge perspective, that probably is not the moneymaker for Big Springs. And actually converting from surface water use to groundwater use without the knowledge, we don't have that knowledge right now, but without that, moving forward toward encouraging people to move to groundwater could really be a hindrance for spring flow production, because the springs, spring forth, if you will, where the water table touches the surface of the earth. And if you pump, you lower that water surface and you could diminish your spring flows. I don't know if pre-development and post-development spring flows have changed remarkably or not. I've been looking into that and there's a lot of discussion around it, but I don't think that question has been resolved yet.
Other questions? Mia, up front, please. Thank you.
Larry Listell. So you might clarify that during the summer, I think Big Springs drops to about 40 to 50 CFS. I don't know if that was said, but my question is, I was hoping you'd say something about the restoration that you've done, taking the cows off, because I found that really, really interesting. And so maybe you could just explain that real quickly and tell us what you think the implications of that are for Coho recovery.
Thank you. I was held to a tight schedule by Amy, so I'm picking and choosing. For those folks who don't know, when the Nature Conservancy purchased that property and we had a meeting and they said, what do you do? What should we do? We said, fence it. And they said, okay, then what? Fence it. And then what after that? Fence it. Just fence it. And remove the cattle from the stream, which had an aspect ratio of, what was it, dip width?
I think the largest width of depth was 300 to 1.
So it was when Carson did his dives, he'd have to turn his head sideways because that's all the depth he could get to look in the water. With the fencing, it was a remarkable response, and that is because there were lots of nutrients. The vegetation grew up. As soon as the vegetation grew up, it began to channel the water into those multiple channels, or a narrow channel like you saw in one or two of Carson's pictures. That scoured out, created a greater depth. Underneath that sand was gravel, which is remnants of the debris flow that Dave mentioned. So there was spawning gravel there. It reduced the travel time. The vegetation then was emergent, meaning that it didn't just stay under the water surface, but actually grew above the water surface and shaded the water surface. I think we had temperatures near the mouth of Big Springs before the fencing in the 26 to 27 C range. I think last year they were about 18. So taking a piece of a river reach, I cannot really think of a comparable river reach that you could take, 8 degrees Celsius off of in a couple of years without doing anything but putting up a fence. It's a remarkable response to the system, and it's just we didn't know what would happen, but we're glad that happened. Is that enough?
Yeah. What in terms of because of the locality of that and the fact that it's occurring at that one spot, where the gradient really changes there and such. In terms of, and that's just happened in the last couple of years. What do you think the implications of that are to sort of what Coho are doing in the system?
So I think the biggest part of that has been something that Mike talked about in his talk with the thermal connectivity between the habitats. In that in 2008, when we first started looking around up there, as the habitat were confined to it was thermal refugia at that point. In that the Coho have gone from having, a handful of small thermal refugia in the system to having kilometers of habitat and not just thermal refugia. And so there's I think Bill talked about it, there's two spawning habitats really in the Shasta River. You have your canyon and your Big Springs habitat. And the Big Springs complex now, particularly during the spring, can be interconnected. So that spawning habitat upstream, that subpopulation, if you will, has the ability to move around amongst those habitats much more freely than they did prior to the restoration began. Not only on Big Springs, but at some of the upstream properties also. Is that what you're looking for?
Okay, who else has a question? Okay, well, we're moving right along. Let's thank our two panelists and